So here's a question I get asked quite frequently, and it's where does my credit score come from, and and I'm going to explain that in a second. So basically, in Canada, there are two major credit reporting agencies. In the U.S., there's a third, and one of them is called Equifax. You're going to have to excuse my handwriting as I get used to this new doodad I've got here. TransUnion is the other one. And so here's what happens. So imagine if there's a fellow and he has some debts, and he has something with CIBC, and he has a credit card with TD and a loan with Bank of Montreal, and then he has something with Capital One. So he has all this credit out there. And what happens is every month, usually once a month, each of these financial institutions will send in data to Equifax and TransUnion. They don't necessarily use both, but it'll either be one or both. So Capital One, once a month, they'll send in and say this is what his balance is on his card. He's missed payments or he hasn't. BMO will do the same thing on a particular day of the month. TD will do the same thing, and obviously CIBC. So all your debts. So then what happens is the credit reporting agencies have their own formula. So their formulas are similar, but they are not identical. So important to be aware of. So they take all of your data from your creditors, and they apply their secret recipe to it, and then they give you a score. So for instance, let's assume this fellow here is pretty decent with his money. He pays his bills on time, and he scores a 708 with Equifax. Here's the thing, though. He may actually score 724 with TransUnion. And for a couple reasons. One, maybe they have different recipes or different formulas for calculating these scores. And the second thing is some institutions don't report to both. So in this example, I'll say CIBC doesn't, but I'm 99% sure they do. But imagine if they didn't report to TransUnion, they only reported to Equifax, it could impact your you could have different scores. So people think, oh, my credit score is my credit score, but there's actually a couple scores. And in the U.S. now they have they use a score that actually is combined from the various agencies that are out there. So the big thing to be aware of is that, for instance, these guys usually only submit your data once a month. So if you have let's say if you had a $5,000 credit card with Bank of Montreal and you owed $4,900. And depending on when they report and when you paid it off, and your plan was to pay it off. So you had the cash, but you didn't pay it off right away, but you were going to pay off the $4,900. Depending on when this reports, if this gets sent out, if the data gets sent out before you make the payment on it, then it would impact your score because it would say, oh, look, your balance is really high. So there are some little nuances to how the formula works. The biggest thing to be aware of is that if you pay your bills on time and if you keep your balances low, so if you had a $5,000 limit, try not to keep it at $5,000. Your score should be reasonably okay. The other thing to be aware of is that you can actually go in and you can request from both of these companies, from Equifax and TransUnion, you can say, I want a copy of my score, or I want a copy of my score and my report. And they will sell you that data. So they take this information from the financial institutions, apply the recipe, give you a score, and then you can actually go buy it to see what's in there. And it's important. Usually I recommend getting the score as well, because if you don't really know, you can get the report, which basically just lines all of your creditors and says, this is what you owe. But without the score, it's kind of meaningless for any lending situation. The other thing to be aware of, let's assume that this fellow here, he pays his bills pretty well on time, but he's got into a dispute with his cell phone company. So let's assume he uses Bell, and for some reason he decides he doesn't want to pay. Well, Bell gets mad at him and says, you know what, we are going to register a collections on your credit score. So even though Bell doesn't report on a monthly basis, if you don't pay them, they can actually will put something on your credit that will lower your score. So and this can happen for a variety of reasons, but so most financial institutions report fairly regularly, but there are others like credit or cell phones are one of the big ones, or utilities. If you don't pay your utilities, that can show up on your credit report, and it will actually be a negative for you. So that's how this credit score is created. It's not necessarily, there are a bunch of nuances, and I'll do another video on the specifics, but that's where your score comes from. I hope that answers that question. If you have any questions, you can send me an email to scott@scottpeckford.ca,